I'll go ahead and start introducing this debate and discussion for everyone. Just be aware that you can use the chat at any point to ask your questions, and we'll use all that in the Q&A session that will take place at the end. So don't be shy. Please do comment and ask us and ask our great experts whatever questions you may have on raw materials and responsible business conduct, because this is what we're going to talk about today. Indeed, over the past couple of weeks, the importance of raw materials has been underlined quite significantly, especially especially by the Commission's launch of its action plans on critical raw materials. Last week also had Commissioner Rangers who visited MEPs in the jury committee to talk about due diligence and sustainable corporate governance. So it is, I think, quite a timely moment to have a chat about these issues. And the main uptake, I think, from the media and from the Brussels bubble in the past week regarding the Commission's action plan was the idea of the critical supply of raw materials, which are going to be important to reach the targets of the European Green Deal. However, I do think that the reliability of supply is just one side of the question, and we also should ask the question of the sustainability of the supply, because it's a matter of coherence at the end of the day. If these raw materials are going to contribute to the green transition of many sectors of our economy, they should also be supplied in a sustainable fashion that kind of respects and complements the objectives set out in the Green Deal. One other point I'd like to underline before introducing the speakers and getting into the proper session is that it seems that there is quite a momentum in the EU regarding the questions of raw material. As I've said, we've had the action plan from the Commission last week, which underlined the field of sustainability in several of its action plan points. I'm thinking about point 2 on financial reporting, point 8, also point 10 on due diligence and sustainable business practices. There is an interparliamentary group in the European Parliament focusing on responsible business conduct, which is pushing, this group is pushing this agenda forward in the European Parliament. There is a lot of work coming from the European Parliament in different procedures to underline the importance of due diligence and sustainable corporate practices. And then we have the ongoing files that touch on this issue. I'm thinking off the top of my head about non-financial reporting. We have the resolution on conflict minerals as well. We have project-specific schemes, such as the one on timber. So we have a lot of things happening in the EU regarding responsible business practices and how we can and should apply this to the raw material supply chain. And the EU is not the only place where we're starting to act about this. It's a global issue inherently because we're talking about raw materials, we're talking about very long supply chains that span across the globe. So there are several issues on the international stage driven by the Sustainable Development Goal 12 that I'm hoping most of the people here today are familiar with. And there is also an important part of the initiatives that are driven by businesses and private initiatives, thinking about the Responsible Mining Initiative, thinking about the questions raised in sustainability in the London Metal Exchange, and kind of all these arenas are discussing how the sustainability of the supply of raw materials. This is, I think, even more timely after the crisis we've had and as we are trying to recover from it, because it's been quite clear that during the pandemic, supply chains that had better transparency and better sustainability were hit less and had and were recovering faster than other ones. So I think there's also an important driver here for businesses to adhere to to this change. It's also a question that's driven by consumer that demands more sustainable businesses and more sustainable business conduct. So I think I'll stop here now and introduce our great speakers. We have Michel Boulot, who is the executive director of the Copper Mark, and who I understand has quite an extensive experience on the issue of sustainability in supply chains and in the raw material supply chains more specifically. So it will be great to hear from you and to hear from what your organization is doing on this, and to hear from your experience about implementing these solutions in the private sector. And with us today, we also have Peter Henley, which is head of the unit Energy Intensive Industries and Raw Materials in DG Grow, who will be able to give us more information on what exactly is going on in the EU and how the institutions are approaching this issue. So without further ado, I think I'll leave the floor to Michel, who can talk us through her work and and about her perception of this issue. Michel, please.
Thanks so much, Igor. Thanks for the opportunity to participate in this session here. Indeed, I'm here on behalf of the Copper Mark today, and we're a fairly new organization. So before you roll your eyes and think you have another one of those, I'll take 2 or 3 minutes just to explain to you who we are and what we do. And in essence, the Copper Mark is indeed a new assurance framework to help the copper industry demonstrate their responsible production practices, and tied that to a larger objective, which is to demonstrate the industry's contribution to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Specifically, we're looking at UN SDG 12 on responsible consumption and production as our starting point. The Copper Mark was initially founded and developed by the International Copper Association, the ICA. So it's an industry designed and developed project, but the industry very early on understood that in order for this to be a credible initiative that has the support and recognition of a range of stakeholders, it also needed to have a certain level of independence. And so back in December 2019, the Copper Mark became its own organization, its separate entity with multi-stakeholder representation in its governance structure. And we launched in April, or actually 30th of March, in the midst of the global pandemic, we launched our assurance process for copper producers. So that's mining, smelting, and refining stage. And I think we're going to talk a lot about the drivers. It's very much the same drivers than we observe in other sectors and for other metals that have also led for the Copper Mark to see the light of the day, which is that responsible practices are really an expectation by consumers, by customers, by investors. So it's increasingly becoming an imperative for the industry to be able to operate, to be able to sell, to be able to have access to capital, to demonstrate responsible practices. And so the copper industry a few years back actually realized that despite what seems to be a broad range of initiatives, there wasn't anything in place for copper. There were several mining standards, but there wasn't any system that would apply to the copper industry as a whole. And so that's really where the Copper Mark came from. It also has at its core this vision that we want to move the industry as a whole. So we're really interested in trying to understand, how do we create a impact at a broad scale? How do we move the middle of the industry? Where there is a number of companies that have been very engaged and continue to lead responsible sourcing and responsible production efforts. But there's also a broad, community of industry actors that are not yet at the table. And so how do we get those companies more engaged and more involved? So I've mentioned our focus on responsible production. We are a little bit different from many of the initiatives that in that we haven't gone out and developed a copper standard. We've actually adopted a set of existing requirements. That is the risk readiness assessment, which is a set of criteria that has been put in place and owned by the Responsible Minerals Initiative. And it covers all the major environmental, social, and governance issue areas. So again, by using an existing set of requirements, we've already built ourselves on work that's already out there. We've already looked to leverage the existing set of standards and systems. It is then an assurance process very similar to what many, I'd assume many listeners are familiar with, in that we require an independent third-party assessment at the site level to demonstrate that indeed the company meets the criteria that we have in place. And again, there I want to highlight the fact that we very much evolve in a busy and dynamic landscape, and so we've incorporated equivalency and recognition as a key pillar in the copper mark, and that means companies that already have assurances or certifications or any existing externally assured and validated system in place can use that to demonstrate conformance with the criteria with the copper mark. So we're not requesting additional on-site work where that's already taken place. The last thing I want to say again is kind of where are we situated? Again, there's a lot of emphasis right now on the raw materials at the mining level, smelting, refining level. Our vision overall is to cover the whole copper supply chain, the whole copper value chain. So we are going to build a chain of custody system in the course of the next 2 to 3 years. And again, that sort of goes back to the recognition that there are a set of standards and actors in place at the mine level. There are, not everybody participates in those initiatives. So we do still see a need to bring, like I said, the full industry on board. But we are also seeing the need really to move up and down the supply chain in terms of information, data that is requested. If we're talking about efforts around the Green Recovery Deal, or if we're talking about goals regarding decarbonization, there is a lot of data that ultimately will have to travel up and down. And so how can we ensure and play our role in making sure that data is accurate and can be relied upon, and to some extent is maybe standardized in the way it is shared. There's a lot more work out there for us, we feel, but in a nutshell, that's who we are and where we are today.
Thank you so much for the insights. It's truly impressive to have such a comprehensive view of the issue, and especially for sectors such as copper, which is important at the moment. And I think it's kind of, it's an important thing to look at this existing initiative and how I think institutions can look at them and draw some lessons from them, and to see at how it can be applied afterwards to other sectors and to the broader issue of raw material sustainability. So I think Peter is the right person to talk to us about what's coming from the institutions on that. So Peter, could you let us know a little more about your work and what you do?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Michelle, for explaining what you're doing in the copper sector. I think it's really important, and it adds to the areas that are now being covered in the metals and minerals sectors with sectoral approaches. But this is an area which is becoming increasingly important. We've been following with great attention what's been done in the OECD, the World Bank, the United Nations system on these issues, and also the various voluntary and industry-driven initiatives. It's actually quite complicated to understand how everything fits together. We're going to try and have a go at doing something on the European public policy front, and we're going to be doing a number of things in the coming 6 to 9 months. You've mentioned already our communication from last week, which is very much about looking at the security of supply and the sustainability as two dimensions which cannot be separated from each other. So we're talking here about identifying where we can get resources for the European economy to transform itself away from fossil fuels. Resources that may come from abroad, may come from the European Union, but wherever they come from, they have to be fully sustainable and responsibly sourced with transparent supply chains. On the regulatory front, we will be coming forward in the autumn with proposal for the batteries regulation, which is designed to help create the market for clean, high-performing batteries for electric mobility and for energy storage. And this will include responsible sourcing aspects for the raw materials that go into these kind of batteries. We're also working on a horizontal approach towards due diligence. You've referred, Igor, already to Commissioner Reinders. So work is underway there, there's target is to come out with a legislative proposal first half of next year on this. And then there's also work on reviewing the non-financial reporting directive, which is about how large companies, report to their stakeholders about how they're safeguarding the longer term interests of investors and consumers on the sustainability issues. So all these things go together. And I'm sure we'll get into more of them as we get into the Q&A. So I'd just like to wrap up by saying we already took a first step when we made the proposal for the conflict minerals regulation 3 years ago. This regulation will kick in from January next year and will apply to the smelters and refiners of tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold. But it also provides a framework within which we can already see how much more broadly we can apply the same principles which are derived from the OECD due diligence guidelines to a wider variety of metals that are used in the economy. But for us, with the current Commission under President von der Leyen, it's all about the European Green Deal. So the European Green Deal is about hitting our climate and environmental and sustainability targets, but also about ensuring that we lead the process, where we can, globally, on clean technologies and having a competitive industry able to deliver the right kind of solutions and demonstrate to customers that what we put onto the European market is transparent and responsibly sourced. Thank you.
Okay, it was a little tough to hear the end of your intervention, Peter, but I think you managed to highlight anyway that there is a lot ongoing and that there is a big rationale to move forward on this question, whether it is driven by the Green Deal objectives or by the demands from citizens and consumers. And that may be my first question, which would be about why you think this issue is important now and why it should be implemented in the years to come to kind of drive the industry forward on that. I think, Michelle, you raised important elements in the fact that there are already companies leading on these issues and driving towards more sustainable supply chains for raw materials. But why would you say it is important for the other companies to join in on that effort and also drive on that? Why is there a momentum to do it now, and why is it of the utmost importance for the raw materials sector? I think it's a matter also of a comparison with the fossil resources sector that is in competition with the raw supply of raw materials. So maybe could you give us, the two of you, in a discussion format, give us more information on why you think the issue is important now, and why you think that raw materials cannot be taken away from the issue of from the discussion on due diligence and corporate responsibility. Michelle, if you want to start, maybe.
Sure, happy to. So, I think there's a number of drivers that are coming together these days in terms of why this is an important topic. And, I think it's both, there's a lot of attention paid on responsible sourcing these days, but at the end of the day, when you're saying responsible sourcing, you're interested to ensure that what goes into your product is produced responsibly. So it really starts with responsible production, in our view, at the beginning, at the raw material level, and then throughout your. And I think, we've mentioned a number of the drivers already. There is increasingly policymakers and regulators that are looking or mandating certain action when it comes to due diligence on your supply chains, when it comes to responsible production. There's increasingly investors that are considering that as a financial risk. So if you're poor performant in how you produce, how do you operate your business, that is a risk. And so that is ultimately about ensuring you as a company retain your access to capital. It is about the social license to operate in many cases, where you have mining companies that need to be able to operate within communities that they're working in a way that is accepted, and in a way that they can run their business, and that ultimately comes back to responsible practices. So I think there's a whole number of drivers that sort of come together to illustrate that this is really not, it isn't a distinction at this point in time in terms of distinguishing your business from others, but I would say it's really becoming the basic expectation that you produce responsibly. And in that sense, I think it's also important to note that we're not always starting from zero, right? Many companies have responsible practices in place. They have systems in place to manage their risks. They have been doing this for a long time. And so in many cases, it is maybe less about setting expectations, and it is about providing frameworks or mechanisms, whether these are voluntary initiatives or whether these are through regulation, but mechanisms to allow companies to communicate what they do in a way that is recognized, in a way that is understood, that is comparable across different actors and different levels of the supply chain. And then again, ultimately, I think we've mentioned this driver of Green Deal is the overall objective in the EU. Then you want to make sure that at the end, when you have a green product, the material that you've used to build that green product, that they're aligned with the claim you make. It's very difficult to have a net zero carbon product if your raw materials are not aligned with that product claim or aren't on the same track. So I really think there's a variety of factors that are coming together these days that are making responsible production an expectation. And that is maybe a stronger call in certain geographies. It is a call, and it's a trend that we've seen intensify and expand from certain raw materials to others, to an increasing number of products. And certainly we've seen it accelerated with the recent attention given to climate risk management and various ambitions and goals that were communicated at national levels in terms of how governments are looking to reach climate goals.
Well, that's really interesting, and you make a lot of really good points, especially on the fact that there are drivers ongoing at the moment that are non-institutional, coming from the investors, coming from the consumers, and coming from the simple fact that there is a need to produce more sustainably. So, Peter, maybe you can give us more elements on why it's important for the Commission to come into play now, and why you think the initiatives that the Commission is coming up are timely. We cannot hear you, Peter.
Yeah, well, we're trying to seize the momentum that we see growing, because the fortunate thing is that already now for some years, businesses have been trying to demonstrate the responsible sourcing, and at the global level, all the key international organizations have been focusing on this. What we see under the Green Deal is that we need to put a lot greater effort into creating markets for clean products, clean and green and sustainable products. So, how do you make these things? How do you demonstrate that they meet the claims, as Michelle has said? And how can you incentivize other businesses or the end consumer to choose these products over other products, which may be cheaper? So you need a lot of information about where things have come from and how they've been produced. You need a whole new kind of sustainable product policy approach, and that's one other proposal that the Commission is working on at the moment, which is very much about looking at the whole life cycle approach to the products and their use and their recyclability, which will complement the other instruments that I've been talking about. So essentially, we see the need to make the most effective use of the huge European single market to create a space where we can pull, if you like, all the work of all the actors into developing much more transparent and responsible sourcing for what goes into the products they wish to sell on the market, whether these be European producers or non-European producers.
Thank you, and I think it's a good introduction to my next question, which was going to be what exactly can we do to get to that point of as Maria outlined in the chat, of managing to bring on board with that, and managing to convince them that these efforts are necessary. And maybe, Michelle, you can tell us a little more about that from your experience at the Copper Mark, on how exactly do we set up these schemes and how do we go about convincing companies that these efforts are necessary.
Yeah, thanks, Igor, for that, and thanks, Maria, for this question. I think it goes straight to the core of whether we are able to scale and achieve the kind of impact that many of these voluntary initiatives are looking for. Right? It does ultimately come down to being able to scale. Look, again, I think it's a combination of different factors. Right? It is an increasing demand that needs to come from customers, from investors, and that will travel, if you want, through the supply chain and reach other companies in the supply chain. I also believe there's a lot of work that needs to go into raising awareness, into explaining how these processes work, why they're important, what the requirements are, what companies need to do. Because again, in many cases, or for many companies, there is a need to better understand what these expectations are. There is a need to understand what they should be putting in place, where there are resources available to help them reach the expectations that have been defined. So quite a bit of work that kind of accompanies typically these voluntary initiatives. And I think one of the points we've touched upon prior to this session was, what are some of the things that these voluntary existing initiatives can bring to the table, and a lot of us do engage in awareness raising and capacity building and training, and really engagement with different companies that can help to accompany the requirements and the expectations that are being set.
Thank you very much for your reply, and maybe to go on this question, Peter, what do you think you can draw in the institutions, in your current streams of work on this issue of responsible sourcing, responsible production, awareness raising? What can you draw from the existing work from business-driven and other type of initiatives?
Well, we participate in many of the international and sectoral initiatives, and have done for some time. But I think what we would like to do is really get the member states and the European Parliament and civil society stakeholders and industry all on the same page. And the best tool that we as a European Commission with the right of initiative have for that is to make proposals, right? Because then you get into the serious discussion. You can actually create the regulatory framework where all these individual initiatives can find their place, right? Because quite often we're talking about the problem of standalone initiatives, voluntary initiatives, is consumers get confused. So you need to have a set of principles within which these sectoral initiatives can be recognized for what they are. Okay, so I think a lot of the effort that we're talking about is coherence and integration, and getting a common understanding of what we want to be doing in Europe and how we can encourage other partners in the rest of the world to be doing the same kind of things. And finally, I think it's also important that the markets shift. We're immensely encouraged by the initiative taken by the LME, because that's the main market globally for the flow of the metals that we are trying to address in terms of the responsible sourcing. So the more that the mainstream market shifts and the investors' expectations shift through the Sustainable Financing Initiative and other things, the easier it will be to mainstream all this stuff.
Well, thank you so much for that. So, as there is a need for coherence and integration, maybe Michelle, you can give us a couple ideas, a couple hints on how this can be done, and how you see your own insurance scheme being part of something maybe larger, of a broader European or international initiative.
Yeah, I think that it's work in progress in terms of creating that framework and that coherence. I'm encouraged, Peter, to hear that that's very much the goal, because indeed, it's a lot of moving pieces. And it does help when there is sort of a common denominator, a framework within which these different pieces fit. I mean, a couple of examples on our end. You've mentioned the LME, the London Metal Exchange, and the fact that they've come out with their responsible sourcing rules. So, one of the things we are leading at the moment with the Copper Mark is a collaboration of different metals to enable compliance with the LME rules. So we're working for copper, nickel, lead, and zinc to jointly develop a single standard, single framework, single tool to help companies that produce multiple metals comply with the LME's rules. So it's a small example, but it's one of those efforts where we can create efficiencies if we start to pull different organizations and different resources together. I think on a much larger scale, and there, if I'm taking the example of the 3TGs or the quote unquote conflict minerals as an example, I think some of these fundamental issues or challenges that we're trying to address in supply chains, whether it's in batteries or whether it was back in the day when the conflict minerals topic was on the agenda, they're much broader. They go back to much broader and systemic challenges, right? I mean, if we're thinking of batteries, there's been a lot of reports around issues with human rights abuses in the way these raw materials are produced. No single company will be able to address those on its own. So it is indeed, there is a need to bring together various stakeholders, governments, intergovernmental organizations, UN agencies, development agencies, etc., that are all playing a part in trying to find a solution. And so I think it is really important to also understand what is the issue that we're trying to address, what is the kind of infrastructure that we need to put in place in order to address those issues, and then to Peter's point, where do these different initiatives fit in this framework? Who can bring what to the table, and how can we start to bring those conversations together?
Peter, maybe you want to add a little on this, on how we can help insert everything together.
Yeah, well, I think we need to have a clear idea of how the sectoral approach and the horizontal approach fit together. I mean, I've given you a couple of examples. We want to do something sectorally around the responsible sourcing for the battery raw materials, but at the same time, we want to address due diligence in supply chains as a systemic issue. All right, and these things fit together, right? And there has to be coherence in the principles that are applied, which is why it's useful to have outside of Europe a kind of reference point in the OECD work as a common base. I would encourage everybody to comment this autumn during the public consultation on this new sustainable governance initiative. And I see a question from Florian. How do you plug in sector initiatives like Copper Mark into demonstrating that these are fit for purpose to show that you're achieving what you need to do in terms of the Sustainable Governance Initiative, or in terms of the conflict minerals? I mean, on the conflict minerals regulation, for example, our colleagues in DG Trade have been spending the last year or two checking the credentials submitted by smelters and refiners, the the systems they have in place for auditing and checking the supply chains of the 3 T's and gold, right? So it's very much about looking at how different sectors, how different parts of the value chain are applying these core principles, and pulling it into an approach where you can see whether it's good enough to come into your market. So sectoral and horizontal, two sides of the same coin as far as I'm concerned. But the last thing I would like to see is for every individual product in the world, you develop a standalone, or every individual raw material in the world, you have to develop a standalone responsible sourcing approach, because I think you'd never finish with that way.
That would be quite the work to come up with a standard for each raw material. And before moving to the Q&A session, I'd like to maybe raise one last point, is the one about costs and the benefits of such initiatives. And is there a way to make sure that the costs will be shared along the supply chain, that the companies extracting the materials won't be responsible for too much of the information sharing processes and of producing that, and of respecting the standards? And is there a way to share this cost? And is this cost, and what will be the benefits for companies when they adhere to such a scheme, when they follow through on due diligence? What will they gain from that? You've been mentioning green markets for greener goods. What will the consumer also, if you could highlight a little, what consumers will gain from all these initiatives? Because we've mentioned a couple of times that there is a momentum that's driven by the demand of consumers. So what exactly will they gain from these, from legislative framework and from voluntary initiatives such as yours? Maybe Michelle, you can give us the first element of reply on that.
Sure, and I'm going to let Peter complement, of course, here and add your perspective. I'd be curious to hear it. Look, like I said in the beginning, I think this is becoming the basic expectation for doing business. So I wouldn't frame it necessarily as a benefit that a consumer gets, and more as this is the expectation to do business at this point and in these days. And it will only, in my opinion, it will only become a stronger request. I think in addition to that, you know, metals aren't inherently consumer-facing products the same way than, you know, coffee or a banana is, where you have a label that you can put on it, right? You're not going to put a label on a Boeing. You're not going to put, you know, 40 different labels on a car for the 40 different metals that are in there. So there is a slightly separate, a slightly different expectation. And I think, again, if we take the example of an EV, there is a consumer expectation that that car was not produced by using raw materials that were produced with child labor, that, you know, it is an inherently green product, and that comes with certain basic expectations.
Thank you so much. Peter, do you want to complement?
Yeah, I think the ability to pass through costs is important, because, and I see this in the other area that I work on, which is energy intensive industries, you know, the big hard to abate sectors. If all the cost falls on the producer, and they can't actually price that into what they're selling, then it's extremely difficult to make this transformation. So you need the end consumer to be prepared to pay a few extra euros on the price of a car for the feeling of assurance that they're not buying some dirty values in the product, right? The same thing for downstream producers from metals. Let's say take car producers, for example. They need to be the ones in their procurement policies that are calling upstream for certain standards to be met on the responsible sourcing, on the reduction of greenhouse gases and negative environmental and social impacts in the processes for the raw materials. You know, the downstream producers have a critical role to play in this, and that's why we are taking this sort of market-driven approach as well as the environmental approach, because we want to create the framework conditions for the downstream producers and the consumers to be pulling the mining, extracting and refining sectors into this new normal.
That was quite clear on what the benefits are going to be, and how, and to reply on that question about costs. So maybe it's time we open the floor to our audience. I see one question from Shivani about new and innovative responsible raw materials and how these initiatives can bring out the products and can make ensure that these products are competitive. Anyone, Michelle, maybe you want to give us a little information on how you see the copper mark could help enhance the competitiveness of innovative raw materials?
Yeah, so again, we don't typically comment on price within these conversations. I'm not sure also whether the question relates to the cost of implementing a scheme, a voluntary initiative for a company, or whether it is regarding products of companies that have already gone through such an assurance scheme. But like I've mentioned before, I think at the end of the day, this is becoming an expectation. And so it is not that much of a distinction, or at least in the way we see the copper mark, as I've mentioned in the beginning. It's the vision is to move the industry as a whole. And so with that, it really isn't about looking to distinguish the best performers in the industry, but it is about continuously improving practices across the industry as a whole.
Thank you so much, Peter.
Well, I think we'll also be trying to address this through one of the actions that we announced in the communication last week. Action 1 is to create a European Raw Materials Alliance, so an industry-driven alliance, but with the involvement of all stakeholders, including member states and non-governmental organizations. We want to see how we can actually attract investments into creating these responsible, resilient value chains that we will need to, let's say, to kind of develop clean steel, but clean cars, clean electronics, and make sure that there's also transparency on the secondary raw materials that will be used. I mean, consumers will start looking for, well, how much virgin material has gone into making my product X, as opposed to making better use of keeping things in the economy that are already in the economy, because we need to also reduce the overall environmental footprint and use of the resources that we have globally. I mean, that applies not just to the raw materials, but also to the water, the air, the soil, and the biodiversity. So we have to make a much greater effort at explaining how a given product throughout its life cycle is improving in all these dimensions. So I think the sustainable financing initiative will help attract investments into the right kinds of projects, including on the raw materials side. We've actually explicitly put an action into the action plan on that. We want to have investment criteria for the mining, extracting and refining sectors in place by the end of next year through the work of the new platform and of the Commission.
Thank you. Michelle, do you have anything to add? I see we're a little short on questions, but fear not, I have plenty to ask you. So if just let me know if you have something to add to this point.
I'm good.
So maybe one thing I'd like to explore a little as a trade policy geek by nature is the more international dimension, because the issue of raw materials is not only a European issue. It has to do with long supply chain that span across the world. And Michel, did you have prior experience of involving companies operating in third countries? And Peter, do you have already experience on engaging with third countries on these issues? I know there is a forum in the OECD on due diligence and on raw materials. And do you know if the demand that we feel in Europe is happening elsewhere, and if other countries, other blocs are thinking about developing such initiatives? Maybe Michel, you can start.
Yeah, so definitely. I mean, I think Peter already mentioned this a few times now. We are fortunate in that there are some international frameworks that are very well recognized and well established, including the OECD's Responsible Business Conduct Guidelines, the UN Guiding Principles. So that there are guideposts that are really globally established and recognized, and within which certainly the voluntary initiatives tend to evolve and upon which we tend to base our expectations as well. So in that sense, it's not a European topic, right? These are expectations and considerations that are certainly discussed at global level. Equally, Peter talked about the importance of downstream, of end user companies, of setting expectations for their supply chain. Now that obviously that supply chain goes into a global network of actors, and with that the expectations go and reach actors outside of Europe. I think it is. The topics are approached differently. I mean, I certainly think climate change is at the heart of many discussions today, not just in Europe. The approaches and the frameworks and the tools that are being used across the globe are different. And so again, there is, as long as we have that overall framework and those overall resources, global resources that we can all point to and refer to, that's certainly a benefit. And then what we found to be helpful is to maintain in the voluntary initiatives a certain level of ability, like I've said, to recognize different paths to get to the same objective, right? If you have a set of standards or guidelines that you use in your geography, but that essentially say the same thing than the requirements we've put in place, then you should be able to use that to demonstrate your conformance. So I think it's also about just recognizing what is the overall objective that we're trying to achieve, and then recognize that there's different paths that can be taken to get to that overall goal.
Thank you very much. Peter, maybe you want to give us more insights?
No, I wouldn't really add anything to that, but I do see that Siobhan is asking a question. It's also about due diligence and responsible sourcing, but it's applicable, if you like, to the clothing side. So it's a little bit out of my comfort zone, but I would say that there's a lot of attention being paid at the moment to how the whole fashion business operates. So production in low-cost countries, but with low pay, low social conditions, a lot of pollution. I mean, you look at cotton production, just for an example, uses huge amounts of water, has led to lots of aridification in certain parts of the world. Schemes to demonstrate that cotton is processed and developed in a sustainable way. But the whole throwaway culture, it's a mix of the way things are produced, but ultimately things are produced the way they are because the end consumer for the fashion items is looking for quick turnover of clothing, not buying things that will last for 10, 15, 20 years, which is what I still do, I'm afraid. And that leads to a huge amounts of waste and use of resources. So, I mean, that's another area, another sector where there's genuine problems, and where I think probably a more sort of horizontal approach combined with looking at the specifics of the sector will help. But on the question you put to Michel, I have nothing particular to add.
I think that's also an interesting issue of how we change our consumption habits and how we change our the way we see products. on our single market and how they can be reused, recycled. I mean, the 3 R's we all know well now. And I'll invite everyone interested in these issues that are in the audience to go check the schedule, because we're going to have sessions on sustainable fashion, on packaging, on extended product, on extended producer responsibility. That's kind of will complement definitely this question. I see one last question, which I'll take as the last one before bringing this session to a close. So Laura asks, if you two see this the trend of mandatory obligations continuing, and how coherence between the different jurisdictions, so between the different member states, can be brought. And I think Peter would tell us that the solution is European.
Yeah, we see this in so many different policy areas. There may be 1 or 2 member states who are ahead of the pack, but then again, you're going to start fragmenting the European single market if you have 27 different initiatives saying how you should deal with due diligence in supply chains. So this is another reason why we're aiming to develop an integrated Europe-wide approach. If I just make a comparison with what we've seen in the last 6 months on the COVID-19 response, where things have got quite messy is when individual member states have done their own thing in terms of closing borders or deciding who can or cannot enter a country. Also, which industries can or cannot continue to operate, whether they're essential or not. So you do need a bit of coherence and agreed principles which everyone applies. Otherwise we're all wasting our time.
Michelle, do you have anything to add on this?
I don't have anything to add to that. Well said, Peter.
So I think during this wonderful conversation, we've seen a lot about the fact that there are drivers that exist and that are getting more powerful to bring companies to the realization that this is in their interest, and awareness is raising among consumers that this is eventually a benefit. And I think one of the keywords of this session has been the coherence, and the fact that there are a lot of different approaches, but there will need to be a coherence at some point to make sure that this, to take a trade term, does not become a noodle bowl of sector-specific, product-specific, and country-specific set of guidelines. This whole festival's goal is to bring out ideas. As you know, we've encountered quite an upheaval recently. So the idea of the goal of the festival is to bring up ideas to help us move forward. So Michelle, could you quickly set out what's the main idea you'd like to bring? What's the main message you'd like to bring to the table?
It would help if I unmuted to share my idea. Look, I think overall, and this is less speaking on behalf of the copper mark, but really I think what we're trying to achieve is there is no magical solution that will be here in the next year or two, right? But it is really about companies generally engaging with their supply chain, engaging with the actors that they encounter in their supply chain, and staying engaged when they see challenges, working collaboratively, working together to solve those challenges with stakeholders that need to be engaged. And we see, change will only happen if companies are willing to invest in the longer term, if they're willing to engage, even in areas where it is more challenging to source raw materials from. And so I think that to me is the key message back to the group is really making sure that, we are building tools and frameworks and mechanisms to assist companies, but all of this is really dependent on companies' willingness to engage and to be a part of the solution in the longer run.
Thank you so much for that. And I think it's important that to underline that everyone will be a part of the solution and that companies have a responsibility on these matters. And Peter, maybe you could also give us one of the main ideas you'll bring back from this discussion.
Yeah, well, I think what I think is really important is that the basic industries who are producing the metals that are used downstream and the downstream industries both start to look more strategically upstream, all the way upstream, to ensure that they can secure the supplies of the raw materials that they will need for the coming 10, 15 years, because other parts of the world are busy locking in those resources. The long-term availability of those resources is not guaranteed unless we are more agile in looking long-term and making those investments. And part of that looking strategically upstream is making sure that the conditions are right for those raw materials that you're acquiring. And a core part of that is the sustainability and the responsible sourcing. You can't just say it's about getting material. Those days are over.
Well, thank you so much to both of you. I think that was a great discussion, and it's quite clear that our future lies into more sustainable sources, more sustainable business practices, including on raw materials. And yeah, I'd like to thank you all very much. I'd like to thank our audience very much, and to remind them that we have a couple of sessions coming up on the construction sector, which is a raw material intensive sector, and that could be interesting for some of you. We also have a discussion on packaging later today, and on the more circular aspects of this question. So please do not hesitate to browse our schedule and to join sessions. To reply to Jose, yes, there will be recordings available, and we'll let you know when these are available. So I'll thank you all very much, and I think we can now close this session.
Okay. Thank you very much, Igor. Thank you, Michelle.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, audience.